So I originally saw Alexsey's videos when they came out, right? I think it was 2018, something like that. And at the time when I saw them, I thought it was really interesting, but I didn't really see a good path forward to being able to try to replicate that, right? It was just what some guy put out there, and I was like, oh, really cool. I hope somebody replicates this. And then waited around a while, and in the meantime, I'd seen some of Charles' attempts at replication on YouTube, and went, oh cool, somebody's trying, but I don't know if he's gonna get success. It looks like he's not really following Alexsey's design super closely or nothing.
Yeah.
And then the APEC came out, and Charles said that he had the original Graviflyer, and not only that, but he had reverse engineered it and taken all the measurements and all the part numbers, and he had made a parts list and a recipe, and he says, if anybody wants to be able to make their own version of this, I highly encourage them. I've made it as accessible as I possibly can, and that lit the fire under me. Within 20 minutes of him finishing his presentation, I was on on McMaster, and I was buying all the parts, and by that night I had all the parts ordered for it. So I was very excited because it was so accessible now. So then I started building it myself and trying to do as best a replication as I could. That's kind of where it started.
So you've got Alexey Chekurkov, who like 5 or 6 years ago, Alexey starts putting up videos online. And I think at the time, most people looked at those and they were like, okay, we're not taking this seriously. And Charlie got bit by the bug. He's the first person that I know of. And I know there are a few other people who have attempted replications out there. So he got involved with this. He started building this, and he got Alexey to send him devices, right?
Correct. Yeah. And when he got the device from Alexey, it was that step that really made it something that now people across the world were getting bit, because Charles had made it so accessible. Because up until that point, we didn't know enough about the thing to be able to even begin to replicate it, right?
Yeah.
It was hard to tell what directions the things were spinning. It was hard to tell the measurements of things. It was hard to tell what all the parts were. So yeah, by actually getting the physical device in his hands, and doing the due diligence to provide the measurements and the part numbers and the circuit diagrams and everything, Charles made it so that anybody could try to do this.
He put it within reach of people, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like he sent me some 4K footage of Alexey's back in 2020, something like that, about 2020. And so this goes to the interesting part. When I first saw the Graviflyer stuff, I saw clips online, and my initial reaction was, this is a hoax. And the reason I felt that was because it's part of this larger ecosystem of videos, and like, to the best of my knowledge, those are at least mostly hoaxes, right? Mm-hmm. And people do really elaborate stuff too. I saw one where someone was claiming things were spontaneously levitating. They had actually nailed all their furniture to the ceiling, and they were dropping stuff down. And so I think most people see that and they just rule it out automatically. Mm-hmm. But in the case of the Graviflyer, he got bit, he started buying parts, he started working with Alexey, he was able to get through them, and it kind of went forward from there.
Yeah, he made it so that he actually had some line of communication, so we could get questions to Alexey, and Alexey would eventually respond to those questions, which was also a very important step, right? Without understanding the way that the inventor is thinking, the steps that the inventor took to get to lift, it makes it almost impossible to replicate. So in order to truly have a chance at success, being in contact with the inventor was very important.
Yeah, super important. Well, so going back to the video that I saw, and again, this goes to most people ruling it out, I guess. When you first look at it, the initial reaction is, okay, he's using a string or fishing line to hold it up, right? And when you start to watch more of his videos, you see him, like, he'll wave his arms over it, he'll move sticks around it, he puts like a hula hoop around it, he's got all sorts of stuff going on there to show people, and he does this like repeatedly, right? Over and over again. He's touching the device, he's doing all sorts of movements to show that there are no strings.
Yeah.
Now, I've seen magicians do that too, but they carefully control the angles. And in Alexey's case, you see video after video after video where he's doing it from different angles in different environments. You know, you see different videos where he'll show the ceiling, there's nothing there. You see the floor, there's nothing there. People have made claims, like I read someone saying, well, he put something under the floor. Well, in that particular video, this was a tile floor on concrete, right? So there's nothing under the floor. So that, for me, was interesting. And when I got the video, it was super dark, 4K footage. So I was able to look really closely. I dropped it into Adobe Premiere, did a bunch of cleanup on it, focused in, and again, I did not see any kind of giveaways there.
So when I started doing this, I was 50-50. I didn't know whether or not it was a hoax or not, but I thought the only way that I'm going to be able to prove one way or another is through my attempt at replication, right? I don't see enough other people trying to replicate it so that we can know for sure whether or not this thing is a hoax or real. I might as well throw my name into the ring and try to do my part to kind of help the community identify, is this thing a hoax or not? And since that point, a couple years ago when I started, that belief that it's not a hoax has grown with every passing test that I do and mini replications that I do. So lift is not the only thing that this thing does. It does a lot of other little things too. And it's those little things along the way that the inventor said you would see as you're trying to test and get it to lift, that he was spot on. He was completely right. He wasn't, you know, hoaxing us, at least with the instructions on how this thing works. For example, you got a lot of electromagnetic interference things coming off of this, and there's specific traits and qualities to these interferences that he said we should be able to observe. And I've observed all of those, which if he was hoaxing, I would imagine he wouldn't know the device well enough to know that it's going to do some of these very nuanced things.
So you've talked about, for instance, it has an ultrasonic dome on it. When you turn on the ultrasonics at a certain frequency, which you specified, the voltage changes, right?
Correct. You get, the very last step to achieving lift is you have this little ultrasound circuit with a little off button, and he pushes this off button to try to catch the sound, he calls it, or catch the moment. And I've done a lot of experimenting with this button to see how does that affect the electromagnetic environment of the craft. And some of the things that he said it does, it in fact does. He says in his mind, it's working on torsion of the ether, twisting these two toroids, counter-rotating toroids of ether. Putting that in more classical terms, think of it like the electromagnetic field, your electric and your magnetic components, right? And that those have an angular component to it, so they're both counter-rotating. And then when you introduce this pulse to that piezo buzzer, you're affecting mostly that top component of the torsion of the toroid or whatever it is. You're affecting that because this drops the strength of the very top of that field. It's like you're disrupting the spin of the ether in that little center of the top toroid.
It's interesting to me that you're following this journey, right? And it starts out incredibly vague, but you're seeing these milestones along the way. And that is really what's interesting. And your enthusiasm and excitement are drawing other people in, you know? So as you're working on these things, like with the oscilloscope, you can actually see the signal for his predictions, which is more convincing. And then as you become more convinced, you draw other people in, you know? So this is one where, like, I get excited about it, but you also have a developing team. So you're working with Charlie, you know, and we don't have him with us today, but you know, he is like one of the primary inspirations for this. And then you also picked up Mike Gamble. Mike is working, I believe, with one of Alexey's original devices. And then you have David Chester, who's doing some physics advice on this. You have a fellow named John Scholtz, who is doing some business analysis and trying to support as best he can, right? Am I leaving anybody out?
Todd Desiato, who has also been around since the first days of this, and has been a contributing member and has some good videos of his early attempts at replication. And he has been a really good advisor as well on the physics side of things on what it most certainly is not.
Okay.
So he helped identify that it's not ultrasonic, acoustic levitation. He's helped cement this idea that it's not ion propulsion, because it would be 100 times more powerful than the satellites up, the $100 million satellites that are using ion propulsion. So he's also been a very valuable member of the team.
And then, in addition to that, you've got this community people. Nathan Bunton is one person. I just met Nathan. He's getting involved in this. Again, I've seen photos of other people attempting these online, although none of them have done the kind of quality or detail that you guys have. So.
Yep. And in those early days when Charles first released the recipe, we had a WhatsApp group that was very active for about a year of people all over the world that were every day sharing their Graviflyers and the things that they were doing. And we had some people over in Europe, and then some people over in Southeast Asia that were doing their own versions of this craft, and every single one of them were contributing in their own ways. So we had a guy from France who was really good. He ended up coming up with a better idea on how to apply the high voltage to the discs, because Alexey uses these brass brushes that are really stiff and they bounce a lot and they cause all sorts of distortions to the things. So he came up, the French guy came up with using carbon fiber out of heating elements for floors, and you can turn that into a high voltage brush that sits very smoothly on the spinning discs. And so now that's primarily what I use.
Well, so a couple other things that are important to point out are the team is working with Alexey Chekurkov. You guys have done long Zoom calls with him. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, so around December of last year, 2023, we started having a more regular interaction with Alexey. Prior to that, it had been, we would send an email with some questions and we would wait a few months, and eventually he would get around and answer everybody's questions all at the same time, which wasn't really a good way if you're trying to iterate quickly. So then come December, we found a Russian translator who made it possible that we could be able to talk to him in real time over Zoom. And Alexey is very hesitant about talking to people about this. No one has gotten to go see it physically in person because he's very concerned, since he has had break-ins into his shop and had his equipment stolen, including Graviflyers that he built have been stolen. So he's very hesitant to have people come visit. So a Zoom call, though, that's something that he was willing to do. So over the course of December through February, we had 4 or 5 Zoom meetings with him. And the first couple of those were us just asking him questions. And then along the way, we convinced him to build another one, because at the time he didn't even have a Graviflyer. He'd gotten rid of all of them. We convinced him to build another one and do a live demonstration for us.
Okay.
And that was incredibly valuable, because we could ask him questions as he's doing all of this secret sauce tuning, and we can find out what his actual process for getting this thing off the ground was. And that really helped us identify some more anomalous electromagnetic things that we otherwise wouldn't have known to look for. It helped us identify the proper steps, because up until that point he had given us a very rough recipe for getting it to lift, but in the Zoom calls we were able to actually nail down, okay, so you said you turn on this part, how long do you keep it on for before you do the next step, right? What are you doing to that after you've turned it on? Very, very useful information. But then come February, he ended up having a family emergency, and so he hasn't been reachable now, so he's gone dark again. And we're not sure if we're going to get a chance to talk to him again.
From what I understand, it's difficult, partly because he's a native Russian speaker, so you have to use a translator. He moves around a lot. He has been living in Western Europe, and so from what I understand, he went back to Russia, right, for his family things. So, So there's a lot going on there, a lot of moving pieces.
He's got a life. He's got a lot of other things, other moving parts going on, and he is also, as an inventor, he wants to iterate on this thing. And so he's already done the Graviflyer in his mind, right? He doesn't want to work on the Graviflyer now. He wants to work on the Graviflyer 2.0. And the 2.0 version uses very different parts that requires a much different manufacturing method. And so that's kind of where he's at right now is, as he eventually does come back to this, he's trying to replace these spinning disks with spinning electrets. He's pretty convinced that that's going to significantly improve its ability to lift off the ground.
Charles Crawford is basically focused on a complete replication by the numbers, doing exactly what Alexey says. You are doing iterative work on this, and then Mike Gamble, from what I understand, is actually using one of Alexey's old devices and trying to get it working based on that. So
yes, so Mike Gamble, as our resident electrical engineering wizard with all of his decades of experience, he is taking one of the Alexey crafts we have, and he is doing very good measurements on this thing. He is trying to get just data off of the thing. Okay. Very important step. Charles is taking all of the steps that Alexey gave us for how to get it off the ground, and he is doing very minor tweaks on these things, right? There's a couple of things that we still don't quite know, which is the speed of the disks and the spacing of the disks and the frequency that the ultrasound needs to be at when you push that button. So with just those couple of variables, there's still a wide window of picking the lock, as Alexey calls it, before you can get the thing off the ground. So their approaches are one direction of approaching this lift, which is, I call it like a classical music method, right? You're trying to follow the sheet music as close to a T as possible. Whereas I'm playing more of a jazz role, where I am riffing off of the ideas in order to try to identify the mechanism of lift. We're all trying to get it off the ground, we're just doing it different ways. And my way is, can I change a lot of different parts in different ways and test those changes one by one to see if I can identify how each component affects all the other components, and then slowly improve that towards the direction where I get the most interactions that hopefully is going to replicate the lift mechanism. I'm less concerned with getting the whole thing to lift itself up like Alexey's, and more concerned about getting it to wiggle a little bit to get, just a little bit of thrust, because I know if I get just a little bit, then I can iterate on that and improve on that.
Well, one of the things that I've seen, I think it's important to point this out, is, again, you're working with detailed signal measurement tools. You've got a good oscilloscope, you've got measuring and, devices to basically understand what's going on at an electrical level. You also have, this thing must be like 100 columns by 100 columns, an enormous spreadsheet that you've been putting together, and that's detailed observations and calculations and predictions, right? And again, truly, truly massive. So this it's not just fly by night, we're going to change something and see what it does. It is very predictive, and it is very well measured.
Absolutely. The table that you're talking about, what I've done is I've taken every medium that is involved in this. So we have aluminum, we have air, and air has a couple of different variables to it, like how humid it is, what temperature it is, and then we have a lot of different lengths of things involved. And so what I've done is I've tried to identify the overlap between the diameters, the spacings, the speeds, and tried to correlate that to this spreadsheet that shows how waves propagate in each of those mediums. So then I can try to hone in on, okay, if I want to have the disks at this spacing, that means that I should be looking for these particular frequencies. And vice versa. If I find a frequency where the ultrasound and the Tesla coil really like to come together, then I set the spacings of the disks for that distance, or I go laser cut new disks so that I have a different size. So now I'm up to 3 different Graviflyers I've built, because I'm trying to hone in on, well, does it need to be larger than the original, smaller than the original? Do I need higher frequencies, lower frequencies? There's a method to the madness.
In terms of construction, you have a round center plate, you have 2 counter-rotating discs Are they counter or are they linked?
Counter-rotating.
Counter. The top disc does not have any magnets. It does have like 4 screws protruding just for construction. The bottom one does have magnets. It has, you'd said that these are neodymium magnets, but he was actually using Alnico magnets on the originals.
Correct.
This rotates. Each of these discs has a voltage applied to it. They're both spinning. You're using a DC voltage with, and basically that's almost like a bias, right? A flyback-based pulse bias. And then you turn on a Tesla coil. So you've got a lot of electrical aspects to this. And then the trigger, as you've talked about, and I think this will lose a lot of people, is a little ultrasonic piezo buzzer inside of a dome at the top. And the buzzer is actually what triggers whatever event Alexey claims is happening.
Correct. There's some overlap between Sal Pais's experiments for the Navy and what's going on in the Graviflyer. One of the things with the Hemfig experiment that Sal Pais did was he spun a conductor that was very highly charged at very high RPMs, and then he vibrated that with a piezo. And he vibrated it at megahertz frequency, so it was vibrating much faster than the kilohertz frequencies we're vibrating at. But according to Sal Pais, that rapid acceleration of those charges, both angular and vertical up and down, is what produced the anomalous results that he saw in his experiments that eventually led to all of the patents that he has put out there. So there's another data point that suggests that there might be something going on here that Alexey stumbled into that others have also replicated in other devices.
So that's worth pointing out, is you've worked with Sal Pais on this a little bit, right?
A little bit, a very small amount. We had the opportunity to interview him during one of our APEC after sessions, and that was quite the treat. And so I got to pick his brain a little bit on maybe how there could be overlap between these two.
Ah, okay. So you've had a lot of input on this, and then this is something where there are a lot of different people, like in the community, as well as various scientists and physicists and other folks, right? Dr. David Chester has taken a close interest in this. So you have a lot of people trying to contribute. Really, it's just kind of educated guesses at the end of the day, but they're trying to contribute their expertise at least to say, okay, this is how this could work. Well, so in terms of method of operation, you touched on torsion, which I think is interesting. I've looked at this, right? We've done some demos on this. It is not any kind of ion wind, absolutely not. It's far too heavy for that, and the amount of air being moved is negligible. I mean,
if this was an ion thruster, besides the fact that it would be 100 times more powerful than a $100 million ion thruster for a scrap-yard, garage-built thing, besides that, in order for it to be an ion thruster, that means it has to spit out metal flakes off of these spinning disks. You have to be scraping off those things and accelerating them. Well, when you do the math for that, you see that the entire disk would be consumed as propellant after just a couple hours worth of full lift. And we see from the devices that Alexey has sent us that they haven't lost, much mass off of these disks. They haven't been scraped to the bone. So we know that it's not throwing off ions in order to do that. And the voltages that we're dealing with aren't strong enough, aren't high enough to be able to be accelerating those ions enough to produce kilograms of thrust.
Well, this brings us back to the mystery of the device, right? And again, for anyone who wants to go and look at his videos, I mean, Charlie Crawford has put a bunch of those online. And, again, once you get bit by the bug, right, you end up going through those frame by frame. He's done that, you've done that, I've done that. And, it's one of those things where, like, your jaw drops and it just kind of stays dropped because it's like, okay, this doesn't look real, but at the same time, it must be. So another thing I should point out is Alexey, I didn't detect any evidence of CGI fakery or anything like that. No one else that I have seen has detected that. I have seen various claims online about he could use fishing line to suspend it in this way. He could do this, like he could use a pole to suspend it in that way. The challenge that I've seen is, again, when you go through those videos carefully, you look at them and you're like, okay, he's not doing that. you know.
He's released about 20 different videos of this thing lifting. It's not just, you know, 1 or 2 videos. Like, when a magician does a magic trick, they normally don't do the same trick in front of the same person more than once, right? And Alexey has done the same trick 20 times. And each of those times he'll do just a little something different to show how this thing is not being supported in any other way. But most of the times he will do enough things like lifting all the wires underneath, passing his arms all the way around the thing, drop kicking the thing. He does all these different things to demonstrate to all of these people who try to dispute his claim that no, this indeed is doing what I'm saying it's doing. So Alexey has already dealt with a lot of people who have tried to call him a hoaxer, and it's the arguments that those people have put forward, he has addressed every single one of them.
Yeah, well, a lot of that is natural, right? Because there are a lot of hoaxes out there. And when you unveil something big, even if you have video evidence for it, you know, people's natural reaction is to say, okay, that's probably not real. It's probably some kind of a hoax. So I can identify with that. I think that it's probably fair and definitely well justified for most people to take a skeptical approach to this, right? I mean, and so like just recording today with you and me, I don't want anyone who watches this in the future to say Tim is saying this is absolutely legit. I think what Tim is saying is everyone who has looked at this closely has kind of come away scratching their head saying, I don't see how this could be faked.
That is absolutely correct. At a glance, it looks absolutely fake. At more than a glance, when you take a magnifying glass to the pixels, it becomes very apparent that he's not hoaxing it, but there's no logical explanation for how something like this is producing lift. So that means that we need to find the logical explanation, which is only going to happen through experimentation.
The other thing that you guys have seen is in these lengthy Zoom calls, and I've seen clips from a couple of these, you'll do multiple hour Zoom calls with Alexey, with Charlie, sometimes probably Mike, I think might be on them, things like that. And he'll walk you through how he's constructing them, how he tests them. You've also had one time where it tipped over and another time where it lifted off on camera, right?
Yep. So in one of the Zoom calls where we had agreed that he was going to just show us the craft that he had finished building, we didn't know that he was getting ready to lift the thing for us, but he was very excited that he just finished building it, but he hadn't tuned the thing very well, meaning he didn't have the spacings and the centerings of the discs dialed in perfectly yet. And when that happens, like it happens in a couple of his videos inside his garage, it ends up just tipping over instead of being able to lift itself up. And that was what he managed to do. And in order to get to that state, it takes about 45 minutes to an hour for a single tuning session. And at that very last step, when you hit the button to make it lift, if it doesn't lift, you've transferred too much charge between these spinning charged surfaces. And so Alexey says you have to turn it all off, you have to wait at least 10 or 15 minutes, let everything discharge and return to normal, and then you can try another tuning session. After 3 tuning sessions, he finally got it to the point where he pushed the button and the thing tipped over. And at that point, I was just dumbfounded. In the video, I'm just sitting there not sure of what I've just seen because I was not expecting it to do anything. I was trying to remain completely skeptical throughout the whole thing. And yet it did the thing right in front of us. And unfortunately, when it does lift up off the ground, it releases a huge burst of energy that knocks out all your electronics. And when it tips over like that, it releases even more energy because those discs decelerate really quick and they short against surfaces, and so you release all this charge. So when that happened in the video stops because Alexey had just destroyed his Wi-Fi router, his laptop webcam that we were using to be able to do it. It messed up a lot of stuff. And then in our follow-up meeting a few weeks after that was when we went through the tuning session again, and again it took 3 tries, 3 hours worth of trying, and finally he hits the button and he catches it, and the thing actually lifts off the ground, and it gets off the ground and is sitting there for a few seconds before the damage to all of his electronics was enough that they all knocked off. And so again, he destroyed his computer, he destroyed his cell phone, he had a space heater, which, you know, space heaters are very resilient to EMP type stuff, but it knocked out his space heater. It was quite impressive the amount of damage that this thing was able to do to everything within a few feet radius around it.
Well, and that brings us to the idea of, you know, like, is this going, like, because presumably you would want some kind of a space drive, you know, propulsion system, you know, eVTOL system at some point. And so you would want to understand that and be able to harness it so that you're not, you know, wiping out your spaceport or your parking lot or anything nearby when you take off whatever vehicle ends up using these. Right?
Yep, if you put this thing up in orbit and it's producing that level of electromagnetic interference, you're going to get in trouble with a lot of different people who have other, you know, very sensitive equipment up there, and don't like the fact that you're flooding the spectrum.
Well, and some of these things, again, like the Tesla coil, those interfere with a lot of different electronics anyways, and things like that can be shielded, right? Resonant coils like that, if I remember correctly, are used inside of TVs, old-style CRT TVs. So, you know, that this is something that probably can be shielded and used more productively once it's understood better. But right now, you guys are just doing initial testing with it. Right
now, I'm not too worried about shielding all of my expensive equipment because I'm so focused on just trying to get the effect I'm looking for. So once I hopefully can get that effect, it's at that point that I can start iterating on safety measures to be able to make sure that it's not going to interfere with anything around you.
Another thing that I wanted to mention is in the videos, when Alexey cuts the power to these, they stay in the air for a few seconds before they drop. So that to me is interesting because it seems to indicate that there's some kind of a persistence to whatever field effect or warping of time-space or God knows whatever it is that's making these things work.
So there's one famous video out in a field that he has where he removes the power for all of his electronics from the single car battery that he's using, and then he pans up to the thing, and when you count the seconds, it's about 20 seconds that thing stays up in the air after he's removed all the power, which that's very interesting. You would not expect it to stay with the lifting effect after you've removed the high voltage and the Tesla coil and the ultrasound and all these things, so some kind of persistent effect. And then in other videos that we have with his lifting, he will turn off everything, and you'll see that it takes a couple of seconds to come back down. And it seems like there's a relationship between how high off the ground it is and how long it will stay in that state. So in the famous outdoor video, it's about 4 or 5 meters off the ground, which is why it's about 20 seconds. But in other videos where it's only about half a meter to a meter off the ground, it's only about 3 to 5 seconds before it falls down once he's turned everything off.
When you see him adjusting controls and things like that, when it's working, I mean, like if he was releasing a string or something, you see both of his hands, right? So he would not be releasing a string in the background.
Unless he's holding that string with his toes. And he lives alone. He's a very introverted person. So there isn't anyone else in his house or anyone else around him that is there to, you know, be his extra set of hands to do the magic trick. So yeah, it's pretty apparent that whatever he's doing by himself, and we've got video with his hands in the frame, so we know that he's not using his hands to make this thing lift off the ground or fall from the sky.
One of the things that reminds me of the lifters with this is kind of the psychological reaction of people. And when they're confronted with the unknown, I think all of us, we fall back to certain behaviors, and those are maybe different for different people, or maybe based on our comfortability. But in the case of the lifters, we used to build those, and again, people have accused them of just being ion wind. And if that's the case, so be it. But the effect that it had on people remains the same. They would come over and visit, and they would see these in the air. And one of the things that always got me was people would just stop and look at it. It took them a moment to process it, right? So when you see things like that, this could go to UFOs or anything else, when it falls outside of your day-to-day reality, it takes a moment, right? And people also tend to have a natural reaction. I would put videos of lifters up online, and we had all sorts of accusations from people saying, this is fake, that's the other thing, you have a string above, you have a string here, you have a string there. You know, I used to respond to those saying, we do have strings, they're tie downs, because if it goes too high, it will cross the power leads and short out. So yes, there are 3 strings that go from the edges to the ground, and they keep it from going above like usually 5 or 6 feet, okay? But nothing ever held those up, and thousands of people built lifters and put videos online, right? So the reactions that people have are based on a rush to judgment and their own expectations and what they feel comfortable with. And with Alexey, I've seen a fair amount of that too.
Absolutely. When something falls so far outside your expectations, the knee-jerk reaction of saying, well, this can't possibly be, I refuse to believe.
Yeah.
That unfortunately is a very natural human instinct. But that natural human instinct is exactly the thing that prevents further development of a lot of really promising ideas. It would be really nice if folks out there would be willing to try to fight that instinct just for a few seconds, to be able to even entertain an idea that seems contrary to their worldview. If folks could do that, we might get a lot farther a lot faster.
Well, the other part is that he's not trying to sell this to people, right? He's not selling kits, he's not selling plans, he's not putting on conferences where he charges money, anything along those lines. This is just an independent inventor. Now, people could make the claim that he's doing it for attention, right? I mean,
they could try to make that claim, but if he was trying to do this for money or fame, you would expect a slightly different behavior. If he was doing it for money, you would think that he would have built a lot more of these. He's only built 6 of these. If he was doing it for fame, you would think that he would still be making a lot more videos and a lot more appearances. But he's an introverted guy. He only shared his successes because all the years of work that he put into it finally resulted in a success that he felt the world needed to see. So if we're going to give the inventor the credit that I think is due to him, he was willing to go outside his comfort zone to share all of his endeavors and his works that finally resulted in a success that, like a lot of smart people out there, he immediately got attacked for this thing that opposed every notion of reality that we think we know.
Well, you could effectively make the case that for every large innovation that has changed our world, it comes back to one person or a small group of very passionate people who are working in a room late nights, after hours, trying to make these things work, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that go into this. And so for me, the human element of this story is I see that with what you're doing, with what Charlie and Mike are doing. Absolutely, Alexey falls into that category, right? And for me, that goes, again, above and beyond whether the device ends up working as a replication. You have this vision, you've gotten bit by the bug, and now the question becomes, can I complete building it? And you're willing to invest the time and energy to make that work, right?
Yep. It took Alexey the better part of 10 years before he was fully successful at this. It took him 6 years before he even got the minor successes. So this isn't something that happens overnight. And I, so far, have only been working on it for a few years now. And of that, only really dedicating the long hours, the long days and weeks and months for about the last year. So I think there's still some room to grow, some more developments to be had down the line from putting in all of that time and energy into developing whatever it is that's causing this thing to lift off the ground.
So the counterpoint to that is, if you're not able to make this work, is there a point that you've earmarked in your own mind saying, okay, I need to call this, you know?
Yes. So right now I have a roadmap for the different iterations, right? My different jazz solos that I'm doing of this thing, right? And once I've played the last jazz solo, that's it, right? I'm done with this music.
Yeah. Well, I think that's more than fair. I mean, you have run through so much of this. And one of the things that I've seen as a friend, as someone who does the conference with you, is a tremendous amount of growth and learning along the way also. And so in addition to the value of the Graviflyer, I think that there is this tertiary value in terms of the growth that you have had, right? Professionally, as well as understanding science and physics, understanding how to use the tools, how to set up a lab. All of these things are moving forward. And so in a strange sort of way, the Graviflyer itself is almost secondary to that.
It's at minimum, it's a stepping stone because the concepts that you have to familiarize yourself with in the process of trying to replicate a device like this results in you coming across a lot of other anti-gravity devices out there, or alternative propulsion devices out there that also look really promising. So as far as getting into the field, this is a pretty low barrier to entry to try your hand at it, but it's not the only entry ticket into the field.
Yeah.
And now I've got a good handful of other entry tickets, other ideas, other propulsion concepts that I think would be really interesting. In addition to that, propulsion isn't the only angle that one can take away. There's a lot of other energy and RF takeaways that one can get from this. The electromagnetic interactions that this thing does, you could repurpose this device to do some other interesting things, like be a little EMP generator, or be an even alternative radio. So there are some directional radio options that you could turn this device into. This device isn't necessarily just a lifting device. One could iterate on this device and create some very exciting new RF technology.
It's quite a remarkable device, and I think that the group that's come together to explore this is even more remarkable. It's wonderful to see this team kind of spontaneously form, and there's this collaboration, and you guys have kind of defined roles, and everyone seems to be working together, and to some degree working with Alexey on this. So
I could run through the actual process that Alexey does for getting this thing to fly. These counter-rotating discs, he spins up these discs, and you have to wait a little while before everything balances itself out. Those magnets on the bottom disc are creating an eddy current in the center disc, and that eddy current ends up creating a secondary eddy current in the disc above it, which then reflects, and so now you have this second, third, fourth order eddy current that's going between all these discs. So it takes a little while after you turn the spinning discs on before everything starts to synchronize together. And only at that point can you then start applying the high voltage to those spinning discs from the flyback. That our flyback is operating at around 40 kilohertz of pulsed DC. And as you apply that voltage, it starts changing the speeds of these discs, which is dependent upon the spacing of the discs. If they get too close to that eddy current magnetic field, that strong magnetic field, the added charge will cause those discs to slow down. If you spread them apart beyond the strength of that eddy current in the center plate, they'll actually start to speed up. So there's a sweet spot there, and there's speed changes there. And those speed changes are affecting those third, fourth, fifth order magnetic interactions from the eddy current. After you've gotten that dialed in with as high a voltage as you can get before it arcs, it's at that point that you can then apply the RF signal from the Tesla coil to the center disk, which that at 2 to 4 kilovolts peak to peak and about 1.2 megahertz, that creates what's known as the skin effect. And the skin effect is this idea that the higher the frequency of your alternating current, the closer to the surface that current is going to travel. So you're taking this eddy current and you're forcing an alternating current into that direct current eddy current, right? So now you have a slightly DC biased AC signal that has been pushed to the very outsides of the surface of that center disk. In the process, that affects the strength of the magnetic field of that eddy current. With its third, fourth, fifth order effects going on there, you've now added one more effect. After you have allowed the speeds of these disks to once again settle back down into a happy resonant state. It's at that point that you can start the long process of turning on the piezoelectric buzzer and trying to find that sweet spot where you have affected the buzzer enough that it's starting to cause a very specific resonant state. Alexey describes this resonant state as a sound that he is listening for, and he calls that sound similar to the sound of a fishing reel unwinding very quickly.
Okay.
And we're not sure yet whether or not it is ultrasonic effects from that, or whether or not we're just using the electrical characteristics of that piezo buzzer to eventually produce this lift. I've done some experimentation recently that suggests that it is not acoustics from that piezo buzzer, but instead is the capacitance of that buzzer and how it's affecting the electric field around the whole craft. Which means that you need to have a very specific setup for that piezo buzzer in order for it to slide right into all of these overlapping frequencies that you're trying to design between the spinning of the disks, the pulse DC, the RF at the megahertz range. You got this wide range of frequencies, and it's all of their subharmonics and their higher harmonics that eventually start coming together to overlap, and you just start building up this stronger and stronger signal from all of these overlappings, and then you pulse that ultrasound, and it creates a big EMP, a big spike in the spectrum that if you've got it dialed in, that spike happens right where you've got all these other frequencies dialed in together. And something about that seems to invert these fields in such a way that now you have repulsive forces on one side and attractive forces on the other side. And that asymmetry eventually gets the thing to lift off the ground.
There you go. Yeah, absolutely remarkable. It's one of those things, again, it draws people in. Jarod, let me thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing all of this with us.
This has been very, very nice. Thank you much, Tim.